So, Ari, there has been a tremendous amount of going on in terms of just the tremendous amount of rulings that took place just a week or two ago in terms of the circuit courts. Some of that has been stayed. I want to get to that in a bit, but first, the story this week that is tied in directly, not just directly into the voting, but also to the campaign, is that Donald Trump has made an announcement that he's going to have special election observers he's looking for on his website. Now, I imagine there's a fee that's involved that you have to pay if you become one of these people and that you get a certain amount of swag. But there is, I mean, I want you to just discuss the history of this because Donald Trump may not be able to do it, or to the extent that he could do it, may end up costing the Republicans another 5 or 10 years on a consent decree. Tell me what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so what Trump said is, well, first he was in Pennsylvania, and he said that people are going to cheat. He said that's the only way I can lose is if people cheat in, quote, certain parts of the state. And then he said he needed law enforcement to monitor the polls, and he was signing up Trump election observers on his website to, quote, stop crooked Hillary from rigging the election. And this was something that immediately caught my attention because the RNC is legally banned from doing this kind of voter intimidation. Basically what happened is in the 1980s, during a special election for governor in New Jersey, the Republican Party sent all of these mailers to people in black and Hispanic neighborhoods in New Jersey. When the mailers, which themselves were inaccurate, came back as undeliverable, the Republican Party tried to purge these voters from the rolls, and they started something that was called the National Ballot Security Task Force. And they put off-duty police officers who were carrying weapons and wearing armbands that said National Ballot Security Task Force to monitor the polls in black and Hispanic neighborhoods. The DNC sued the RNC, and the RNC was banned from undertaking any, quote, ballot security initiatives. And so that kind of thing, if Trump tries to do it...
All right, wait. Now, let's just slow down for a second because this is such an insane story. I mean, we've heard, and certainly it seems to be ongoing, this element of sending letters to registered voters and then claiming when they don't get a response or if the letters get sent back that these voters are ineligible. That practice still continues, doesn't it?
Yeah, people still try to do that. It's what's known as voter caging, and often what happens is the initial lists are often inaccurate. And so mailers get returned, but that doesn't mean that registered voters won't actually be casting ballots. And then these people's names are put on voter challenge lists, and then they show up at the polls. They don't realize there's a problem, and in fact, they've either been purged from the voting rolls or their right to vote has been challenged. This happened recently as the 2004 election in Ohio, and there's obviously been lots of other voter purge efforts since then. But specifically, doing this with the purpose of intimidating voters at the polls, based at least in part on race, is what the RNC is banned from doing. The other thing I should mention is that Trump's call for law enforcement to monitor the polls in Pennsylvania is expressly illegal under Pennsylvania law and other state laws, and also possibly federal civil rights laws as well, because that's not the way that law enforcement is supposed to be used. In fact, in Pennsylvania, they can't even be within 100 feet of the polls unless there is a really compelling reason for them to be there that doesn't include monitoring the polls.
What is the foundation and the argument in that case? Why you wouldn't want police officers standing at the polls?
Well, I mean, I think it's not that hard to figure out. It's intimidating to people, particularly in black and Latino neighborhoods where relations between the community and the police are not always the greatest. And they're supposed to be monitoring the safety of the community and not monitoring who votes. And so we have election officials who run elections. We don't need police to run elections. And so lots of states have tried to prevent the police from participating. Also, remember, before the Voting Rights Act, in places like Selma, Alabama, it was the police who in many cases were disenfranchising people. It was law enforcement, people like Sheriff Jim Clark in Selma, Alabama, who was enforcing poll taxes and literacy tests. And so there's a long history, unfortunately, of law enforcement intimidating voters and just in general of people at the polls challenging other voters based on race and other discriminatory factors.
Right, and we should be explicit about this. There's a long history of police intimidating black voters at the polls. I mean, because there's a lot of, I think, people who are listening to this, white people, who say like, "But what? The police aren't intimidating. They've never stopped anybody I know from voting at the polls." And so we've got to make this clear that within the context of this voter intimidation, to the extent that there has been ongoing voter intimidation. Now, I'm sure there was a time, maybe in when we were back in the sort of the gangland, the Tammany Hall back in New York, you would have seen recent immigrants being intimidated as well. But clearly there's an ongoing relationship here. So getting back to that National Ballot Security Force task force in New Jersey in the 1980s. The DOJ basically says you're prohibited from doing anything like this, and there was a time horizon on it. This was challenged, my understanding was, back in 2013 at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, dominated by Republicans, still said this still has to be in effect.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, it's set to expire next year. And so Trump's activities here, if he actually tries to go through with his election monitoring plan, could actually make this consent decree last even longer. Because if Trump is acting as an agent of the RNC, and he's clearly the nominee of the Republican Party, whether some Republicans like it or not, then if he tries to intimidate voters based on race, this consent decree against the RNC is going to be extended, and this kind of activity is going to be blocked.
You know what it strikes me, because I hadn't heard of this consent decree until Donald Trump this week made this suggestion of having his brown-shirted, maybe, to be fair, maybe just they'd be red-hatted, thugs sit in front of election places, polling places. But how is it, Ari, that in 2013, the Roberts Court can look at this and say, "Yeah, we're not going to overturn this consent decree," where you clearly, it's speaking to the Republican National Committee, clearly tried to disenfranchise, minorities and to intimidate them from voting. How is it that they could also then rule that, like, well, there's not any racism left in this country in terms of voting, so we can gut this this preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act? I mean, it makes that decision even more bizarre in some ways.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I mean, so I don't think that this was an issue that John Roberts was fixated on. I mean, I think the Supreme Court basically deferred to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which had a very extensive opinion on the consent decree and basically listed all of the examples of the RNC trying to violate the consent decree since the 1980s. I mean, they repeatedly tried, whether it was in Louisiana in 1986 or in North Carolina in 1990 or in Ohio in 2004, to do the very type of voter intimidation against African Americans that they were barred from doing. So there was a long record of why they should still be covered by the consent decree. My view, and what I write in my book, Give Us the Ballot, is that John Roberts had been trying to gut the Voting Rights Act for 30 years, ever since he was a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department, and it didn't really matter what the facts in the Voting Rights Act case were. He wanted to do this regardless. This is something that he had been fixated on for 30 years, that the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional, that treated some parts of the country different than other parts, and that he was going to do this at all costs, regardless of what the evidence in that case or other cases said.
Oh, that's interesting. So he had an ideological predisposition against the preclearance provision. Is that what you're saying? And he just found convenient facts or convenient fictions to justify it when the case showed up.
Well, what Roberts believes and what the Reagan administration believed in the 1980s, and really what has been a central tenet of the conservative legal movement, is that laws that were designed to stop historic instances of discrimination, like the Voting Rights Act, had to become in and of themselves discriminatory. That in Antonin Scalia's famous words, the Voting Rights Act had led to a, quote, perpetuation of racial entitlement. And so I think that Roberts, unlike with the consent decree, I think that Roberts believed that the Voting Rights Act was something that was doing more harm than good, not just Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, but other parts of the Voting Rights Act as well that he tried to challenge in the 1980s. So I think this was a very ideological decision for him. Remember when Roberts said in the school integration case that the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race?
Right.
Now, that's a very simplistic way to view race relations in this country, but I think Roberts has his ideology in this area, and he's sticking to it.
All right, we got to take a quick break. When we come back, let's talk about some of the get an update on some of the more recent cases involving the fallout from the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. We got to take a quick break. We're talking to the great Ari Berman, Sam Seder on Ring of Fire. We'll be right back.